Good evening, my little creatures of the night. Mr. Wendigo back again with your late night creature feature. Before we begin, I'm curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Alone in your room? Driving through empty roads? Drop a comment and let me know. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now then, let's see what tonight's tale brings us. The Quiet Elk. Earl Vance had been farming the Blackthorn drainage for 30 years, the same stretch of bottomland his father had worked and his grandfather before that. And he had the particular stubbornness of men who have decided a piece of ground is worth their entire life and arranged everything else accordingly. He ran about 40 head of Angus on the south pastures, had a kitchen garden his late wife Dottie had planted that he maintained out of guilt and loyalty both, and had a blue heeler named Coco who had come after a border collie named Biscuit died the previous October. Coco had no interest in being a replacement for anything. She was her own project. Coco was 3 years old, built low and wide, with the blue merle coat that gave the breed its name and the particular intensity that distinguishes a working dog from a pet. She worked the cattle efficiently and without drama. She worked Earl the same way. She occasionally worked Bobby, Earl's 19-year-old son, in ways Bobby did not appreciate and that Earl found quietly satisfying. She had opinions about strangers in the south pasture, and she communicated those opinions with an efficiency that made human language seem wasteful. Earl called it in on a Tuesday. Said there was a bull elk standing in the low meadow off Blackthorn Flats, and it hadn't moved in 3 days. Said the wolves wouldn't touch it. Said Coco wouldn't go near the south fence line anymore, and she was a dog who had never in her life refused a fence line or anything on the other side of one. I told him I'd come out. I want to write this the way it happened, which means I have to write the meadow first, before the rest of it, before all the slow business that came after. Because the meadow was the thing that told me what kind of story this was going to be, and I don't think I did myself any favors by not turning around the moment I saw it. Blackthorn Flats sits in a bowl about 2 miles off the secondary access road, low ground where the drainage from 3 ridges meets and the soil gets boggy in spring thaw, good elk country in fall. Too wet and exposed for most animals once the snow pulls back and the ground turns soft. A bull elk standing in the middle of it in late April with nowhere to shelter and nothing to eat but last year's dead grass wasn't unusual enough to call in on its own. Until you saw it. I came through the tree line at the east end of the meadow and I stopped walking because my legs decided that was far enough. The elk was maybe 80 yards out, a big bull, 6 points, the kind of animal that earns its own weather. Standing in the center of the flat ground with his head up and his rack catching the morning light and his eyes open. I watched him for a full minute. He didn't move, not a twitch of the ear, not a shift of weight. Not a breath I could see from 80 yards, even though the morning was cold enough that breath shows. Just standing, head up, eyes open, fixed on something on the far tree line that wasn't there. Then Coco hit the end of her lead and started screaming. Not barking, screaming, every hair on her spine up and her body low to the ground, and her voice going somewhere a dog's voice isn't supposed to go. Earl grabbed her collar and she twisted against his hand and kept screaming at the meadow, at the elk, at the 80 yards of dead April grass between us and whatever was standing in it wearing that animal like a coat it had borrowed and hadn't learned to move in yet. That's when the elk turned its head. Slow, too slow. The rack swung around and the eyes found us and they were open and they were the right color and they were completely, entirely empty. Not glazed the way a sick animal glazes, not dull the way a dying animal dulls, empty. The animal that had lived behind those eyes had stepped out somewhere between here and wherever elk go, and the thing that had stepped in behind it hadn't quite figured out what eyes were for. Earl said, "Lord have mercy," very quietly. I didn't say anything. I was busy writing what I was seeing into the part of my brain where I keep the things that don't go in the official report. The elk held our gaze for about 10 seconds, then the head swung back, same slow mechanical arc, and it went back to staring at the far tree line. Earl looked at me. I looked at Earl. He'd lived his whole life at the edge of this country, and he was 60 years old, and he knew when the country was telling him something. "How long?" I asked. 3 days I know of. Could be longer. I don't come down to the south fence more than twice a week. "Go home," I said. "Keep Coco inside at night." He didn't argue. Coco looked back at the meadow the whole drive out, never made another sound, just watched, low and steady and watching. I went back alone the next morning, and the morning after that. Dale Rucker was supposed to be my partner that week, but Dale had a theory about the elk, and theories keep a man in the truck writing field notes while other men do the work. I let him write his field notes. Some things you need to see alone first, before you decide what you're going to say about them. The elk was in the same spot both mornings, same position, head up, rack catching the early light, eyes forward and not registering anything I could identify. I walked the meadow edge to the north, checking the ground. The boggy soil around Blackthorn Flats keeps a record of everything that moves across it, and the record it was keeping those mornings said the elk had not moved. Same compressed ring of dead grass, no tracks in or out overnight. Whatever it was doing in the center of that meadow, it had been doing it without shifting its feet. The birds were the next thing I noted, a pair of sparrows working the ground near its front hooves, picking at dead grass for seeds, paying the elk no mind. A raven landed on its back and walked the spine from shoulder to hip and flew off without hurrying. The elk didn't register it, didn't flinch. Didn't do the thing any living animal does when something lands on it, that automatic skin shiver. Nothing. Not sick. Sick animals twitch. Sick animals have something left that reacts. This one didn't. I was writing in my ledger when Dale's truck came down the access road on the second morning. He'd changed his mind about the field notes. Dale Rucker was 28 years old and had a forestry degree from the University of Tennessee, and the particular confidence of a man who has read extensively about the woods without spending enough nights in them. Good kid, not a bad ranger. He'd be a fine ranger in 10 years if the mountains got the chance to finish his education. He just thought knowledge and experience were the same thing, and the mountains hadn't corrected him yet. "Chronic wasting," he said, looking through his binoculars. "Classic presentation. The neurological involvement explains the fixed posture." "Explain the wolves," I said. He lowered the binoculars. "Fucking wolves?" Earl Vance reported a pack working the south end of the flats 2 nights ago, came within 50 yards and turned back. Wolves are cautious. Disease smells wrong to predators. Wolves don't turn back from a sick elk. Sick elk is easy. Dale put the binoculars back up. "I'm calling the wildlife biologist in Knoxville. Get a proper assessment." "You do that? You're not going to approach it?" "No." He wrote something in his notebook. I didn't ask what. He had good handwriting, small and precise. I'd always noticed that. He drove out around noon, and I stayed until the light started to fail, and the meadow went gray, and the elk stood in the middle of it without moving, without shifting weight, without registering the dark. Fixed in place as the day ended without it. I sat in my truck at the meadow edge until midnight. I don't know what I was waiting for. Confirmation, maybe. The kind you can't put in a report but can't stop looking for. At 12:17 by my watch, the elk took 1 step forward. Left front hoof. Set it down. Stopped. Working through each piece of the motion separately, the lift, the extension, the placement, the weight transfer. Then it stopped. Went back to standing. Head up, eyes forward. 1 step, 12:17 a.m., April 22nd, 1976. I wrote it in the ledger, the real ledger, not the one that gets filed. Third morning it took 3 steps, each one deliberate, each one a solved problem, then back to standing. It was running drills in the dark when I wasn't there. I knew it the way you know what a place has been used for even when you weren't there to see it. The ground remembers. The air holds things. The next morning, Earl called the station before I was through my first coffee. Said Coco had been at the south fence all night, not barking. Standing at the wire in the dark with her belly low and every hair raised, eyes fixed on the direction of the flats. He'd carried her inside at 3 in the morning. She'd gone stiff in his arms, dead weight, her eyes still pointing south over his shoulder the whole way to the house. He set her down in the kitchen. She didn't move until dawn, just lay there with her chin on the floor and her eyes at the door. "How's Bobby?" I asked. A pause. "He's been watching it, from the ridge. Don't tell him I told you." I told him I'd talked to the boy. Lottie Pruitt had lived on the north end of the Blackthorn drainage for 71 years, and she'd outlasted 2 husbands, 1 house fire, and a county road commissioner who tried to put a gravel road through her property in '64. The road commissioner had eventually transferred to another district under circumstances nobody talked about directly. Lottie was still there. Her kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the dried herbs she kept in bundles on the ceiling beams, sage and mugwort and things I didn't recognize. She had the fire going even though April was warming up because Lottie ran cold and always had and didn't apologize for it. The kitchen was warm and low-ceilinged and full of the particular order of a woman who has arranged a space to her exact specifications over many decades and resents any deviation. She poured me coffee before I sat down, set a plate of biscuits between us, looked at me the way old women who've seen things look at men who've just seen things for the first time. "You've been to the flats," she said. "4 times. So you've seen it." "Yes." She nodded slowly, wrapped both hands around her mug. My grandmother called it the hollow one, not Cherokee naming. Older than that, from the families who were here before the Cherokee came into this country. The word doesn't translate clean, but hollow is close enough to what she meant. The fire talked in the stove. Outside, the April wind moved through the cedars. "It finds things that are almost gone," she said. "Not dead, almost. An animal near the end, that last breath still in it. It steps inside before the breath goes out." She looked at the window. "The animal's gone by then, left already. What's left is just the shape." I set my mug down. "Possession." "No," she shook her head. "Possession means something still inside to push against. This isn't a fight. There's nothing left to push against. It's not fighting for the body." A pause. "It's just using it, the way you'd use a coat." I thought about the raven walking the elk's spine, the sparrows at its hooves, every living thing treating it like it wasn't there anymore, because whatever had made it alive wasn't there anymore. How long does it use the shape? Until the shape wears out, or until it finds something better. Better how? Lottie looked at the window that faced south, toward the flats. She held that look for a long time. When she turned back, her face was careful. "Bigger," she said, "more capable. Something that can move through the world in more ways than a bull elk." She let that sit. My grandmother was plain about that part. It's not satisfied with what it has. It's always looking at what it could have instead. I knew what she meant. I didn't say it and she didn't say it, and we sat with it between us in that warm kitchen taking up space. "How do you stop it?" "Running water. Old rule. The hollow one won't cross moving water." My grandmother never knew why. Didn't matter why. Just knew it was true, and her mother before her knew it, and you don't need to understand a fence to stay on the right side of it. She poured more coffee and set the pot back on the stove. "Don't let it learn you," she said. "Every time it sees you, it takes something. Your walk, the way you carry your weight, the shape of how you stand. It's building a picture of you piece by piece, and the longer you let it look, the more complete that picture gets." She said it flat. Statement. Not opinion. My grandmother said the ones it studies long enough, it can wear them too, when the time comes. I sat with that. What do I do in the meantime? Don't go back alone, and don't let the young one go back at all. Bobby Crisp. She nodded. Earl's boy, he's been up on that ridge with his binoculars. I've seen his truck at the access road in the mornings. I'll talk to him. Lottie looked at me with the settled knowledge that telling a 19-year-old not to do something and him not doing it are 2 different outcomes with no reliable connection between them. She was right about most things. She was right about that too. Bobby Crisp was 19 and had his father's eyes, that flat gray blue the mountain families get when they've lived long enough under the same sky that it starts to leach into the bloodline. He was lean, not yet filled in by work, with calloused hands that had been doing fence work since he could hold wire. He had a habit of spreading those hands flat on whatever surface he was sitting at when he was thinking, like he needed the anchor. He'd been accepted to the agricultural program at East Tennessee State for the fall. Earl had mentioned it once, offhand. Bobby was going to come back to the drainage with credentials and do what Earl had done by instinct, but with the science to back it up. Earl thought that was fine. Earl thought most things Bobby did were fine. Bobby found me at the station the morning after I'd seen Lottie. He'd heard I was looking for him, came in on his own, sat down across the desk, and spread his hands flat on the surface. "I've been watching it from the ridge," he said, "before you say anything." "I know. 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at the desk. "It walked last night, not one step, a full circuit of the meadow." I sat back. "What time?" "Around 2. Couldn't sleep. I had my flashlight and the binoculars." He looked up. "It went all the way around the edge of the flats and back to center. Took about 20 minutes. The walk was..." He stopped. "Say it." "Wrong. Like watching somebody walk in slow motion who's also never walked before. Every step was a decision made separately from every other step. No rhythm to it. No habit." He paused. "I've watched cattle my whole life. I've watched deer. I've watched elk in the fall. They all move on automatic. This wasn't automatic. This was arithmetic." He looked back down at the desk. "And the whole circuit, every step of it, it was walking. It was walking fucking backward, not like an animal backing up. Forward facing, moving forward, but the motion itself was running in reverse, like watching film being rewound, but the elk doesn't know it." He stopped. "I don't have a better way to say that." "You said it fine," I told him. "Did it look up at you?" Bobby's hands went still on the desk. Once, at the end, it stopped in the center and it turned and it looked straight up at the ridge, right at me. He paused. "I don't think it could see me at 300 yards in the dark." I didn't tell him I wasn't sure seeing worked the same way for what was in that meadow. "Bobby, I need you to stay away from the flats. The ridge, the access road, the south fence, all of it." He was quiet. "This isn't a wildlife situation," I said. "This isn't something you document and report. I need you to stay home and stay back and let me work it." "What is it?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Lottie's kitchen and the word hollow and what she'd said about the collecting, about what it was building toward. "I don't know exactly," I said, "but it's been watching you from the meadow the same way you've been watching it from the ridge. And one of you is going to get something useful from that, and it isn't going to be you." He nodded. He said he'd stay away. He was lying, not with malice, not even with full awareness. Just the way 19 lies when you tell it to stay away from something that lives at the intersection of fear and fascination. The two forces that combination is more reliable than gravity in pulling young men into bad country. I found him at the meadow edge the next morning at first light. He was standing at the east tree line where I'd stood that first Tuesday, still, head up, eyes forward. The elk was 20 yards out facing him directly, and the air between them had that quality I'd first noticed at the end of Cade's boot prints in the Cat Creek Basin the previous winter, battery taste. The taste of air used for something it wasn't designed for. "Bobby." He didn't turn. "Bobby." Louder. The elk's head swung toward me, that slow mechanical arc. The eyes found me and I felt the cold drop behind my sternum, a chill that had a shape and a direction. It was looking at me and taking something. Every time it sees you. Bobby turned then. Same arc. Same mechanical weight transfer in the shoulders before the head followed. His eyes were open. His face was his face. But what had lived behind those eyes had stepped out, and something else had stepped in, and I knew it the way I'd known the elk was wrong on the first morning. Not from one detail, from all of them at once. 2 vessels, running 2 shapes at once. I backed up. Bobby's head tracked me. The ELK's head tracked me, synchronized. Two ends of the same thing watching me from 20 yards apart. I moved through those trees. Behind me, I heard Bobby take a step in that meadow, that deliberate placement, learning the weight of a different body. I didn't look back. I drove back to the station and tried to raise Dale on the radio for 2 hours. Nothing. His truck wasn't in the lot, wasn't at the Blackthorn access road when I drove back out at noon. He'd told me the night before he was going out to the flats at first light with a tranquilizer kit from the wildlife office in Knoxville. Proper procedure. Document, assess, tranquilize if necessary. He'd gotten the biologist on the phone, and the biologist had said the presentation didn't match chronic wasting, but Dale had a different read and he was going out regardless. I should have driven to his house that night, sat on his porch until he agreed to wait. I didn't, because the part of me that still wanted the rational version had been wrong since Tuesday morning, and I'd let it keep voting anyway. That's the honest entry, the part that stays. His truck was at the Blackthorn access pullout, empty. Keys on the seat, his field kit in the bed, unopened. The tranquilizer kit was in the meadow. Set down in the dead grass about 40 yards from the center circle, not dropped, set, careful. The latch was open and the foam interior showed the syringe and the dosage vials laid out in sequence, prepared and never used. He'd knelt to set it up, gone through the motions he'd been trained for, then stopped mid-motion, didn't finish. His boots were in the center circle, upright, laces still tied, the double knot you do in the morning without thinking, the knot that's muscle memory by the time you're Dale's age. Standing on their own in the packed dead grass with the tongue still pulled up and the inside still shaped by a foot. No Dale above them. No blood, no drag marks, no scuff in the dead grass where a body falls. The ground in every direction was undisturbed. He hadn't fallen, hadn't been dragged. The boots were standing where they'd been standing when Dale was wearing them, and the rest of him was simply gone. I crouched next to the right one. It had a strip of duct tape wrapped around the toe where the rubber had started to separate from the welt. Dale had been meaning to get new boots for 2 seasons and hadn't gotten around to it. I'd watched him wrap that toe with tape in the break room 3 weeks prior, griping about what a decent pair of work boots cost now, asking me would I pay for mine, doing the math on whether he could wait until fall when the outfitters ran their clearance sales. He decided he could wait. I stood up. The meadow was empty. The ELK was gone. Bobby was gone. The boots stood in the center of the circle, upright, empty, waiting. I picked up the tranquilizer kit, carried it back to Dale's truck and set it in the bed next to his field kit and stood at the tailgate looking back at the meadow, the circle in the center, the upright boots. Nothing moving. That afternoon, Earl called. Coco had broken her lead in the night. He'd found her at the south fence post at dawn. The chain snapped where it attached to her collar ring, the free end of the lead wrapped around the post wire where she'd pulled against it for hours going backward. She'd been barking and lunging at the fence, snapping at the wire, foam on her lips, her whole body pointed toward the flats and nothing else. It had taken Earl and his hired hand Eston both to drag her back from the fence. She'd fought them, not play fighting, not working dog stubbornness. Fought them like something was on the other side of that wire that she needed to get to, or something was coming through that wire that she needed to stop. Earl got her inside. Coco lay down in the front room and didn't move for 6 hours, eyes open, watching the south wall. She'd never broken a lead in 3 years. I stood in the station parking lot after I hung up the phone and looked at the sky for a while. April sky, high thin clouds and the light going flat toward evening. Normal sky, the kind that doesn't know or care what's happening below it. I drove to Virgil Hatch's office and told him everything. Virgil Hatch was the kind of man who wore his jurisdiction the way some men wear a sidearm, visibly, with the safety off. He'd been a game warden for 22 years, and in those 22 years he had put down 3 black bears and 1 mountain lion that had become problems. And he had the documentation to prove each one, and he'd show it to you if you asked, and sometimes if you didn't. He was 54 years old with a broad chest going soft and a gray mustache he kept trimmed precisely, the one thing in his life that stayed fully under his control. Married 31 years, kids grown. He could quote the page number for any regulation in the state wildlife code and did so regularly. He listened to everything I said. 2 missing persons. 1, Bobby Crisp, last seen in apparent compromised state that I could not fully account for. An elk behaving outside every known parameter. A set of boot prints standing empty in a meadow with no body to explain their presence. At the end, he set his pen down. I'm coming out tomorrow morning. I'm bringing the rifle. Virgil. It's a diseased animal in a public access area. That's a straight line from here to a trigger pull. I told him what Lottie had said. The hollow one, running water, don't let it watch you. The picture it builds piece by piece every time it sees a face. Virgil said Henry in the tone men use when they're being patient about disagreeing with everything you just told them. I hear what you're saying, he said. I do, but I've got 2 damn missing persons. One of them, a fucking minor, and an animal that is a documented hazard in a public area. I have a legal obligation to act, and I am going to act. He picked the pen back up. You can come with me and give me what information you've got, or I can go without you. Your call. I went with him because the alternative was worse. We drove out before sunrise. The access road still had frost on it, the mud frozen enough to take tire tracks without sinking. Virgil drove. I looked out the window and went over Lottie's words again in the order she'd said them. Running water. Don't let it learn you. The new shape when the old one wore out. The flats were gray in the early light, the meadow still and flat and waiting. The dead grass circle was easy to see even from the tree line, brown against the spring green that was trying to come up around it. Trying and failing. The elk was in the center. It looked different. The posture had shifted, subtle enough to miss if you hadn't been watching the same animal for a week. The weight distribution was closer to right now. The legs had the correct bend at the knee. The head carried at a natural height. It had spent a week practicing, and the practice was showing. The original wrongness had been obvious, impossible to misread. This was becoming something you might almost accept at a glance if you didn't know to look for the wrongness underneath the rightness. That was worse. That was considerably worse. There it is, Virgil said. He raised the binoculars. Big one, 6 points. A pause. Something's off. Yes. The posture. Yes. He watched through the glasses for another minute. Then he lowered them and unslung the rifle from his shoulder. I'm putting it down. 1 shot. This is over. Virgil, the creek is 40 yards east. If something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong. He chambered around. Stand back. The elk moved. Not elk fast. Something else entirely. A speed that body had no right to carry in the meadow ground, no right to allow. It crossed the space between us before my brain processed the fact of motion, and it hit Virgil from the side with the full mass of its shoulder. He went down hard. The rifle spun out into the grass. The front hooves came down on his right arm, both of them together, all that weight through 2 sharp points. The arm went flat the wrong way, and the sound it made was wet and dense and final. Virgil screamed once. The elk's head drove down into his chest, not goring, not tearing, pressing. The full weight of that skull bearing down, finding the give in his ribs and pushing through it. Something folded in Virgil's chest that was not supposed to fold. I drew my sidearm and put 2 rounds into the elk's flank, center mass. I heard both hit. The elk did not register them. It lifted its head from Virgil's chest and looked at me, not empty now. The eyes were full of everything it had been collecting since that first morning. Bobby's posture in the set of the neck. Something older and deeper underneath, compressed below all the borrowed shapes, patient and deep in measuring me, not done. I ran toward the creek, not away from the meadow, toward the creek, to the east. Blackthorn Creek cuts the east end of the flats, the drainage from 3 ridges running hard in spring thaw, cold and fast over flat stones. I had crossed it on the stepping stones that morning without thinking about it. I was thinking about it now. I hit the bank and went across without stopping. 1 stone, 2, 3. Cold water over my boots at the crossing point where the stones were submerged. I got to the far side and turned. The elk had followed me across the meadow at that speed. It stood at the water's edge with its front hooves 3 inches from the bank. Dead stop. The hooves were right at the edge of where the bank met the water, the soil dark and wet, 3 inches, and it stopped as though it had walked into a wall nobody had built. 12 feet of fast cold water between us. We stood there, eyes locked, my chest heaving, my boots soaking, the creek talking over the stones in that steady voice it has in April when the snow melt is running hard and the water knows where it's going. The eyes held me, still collecting, my face at this distance, the way I breathed when I was scared and working hard to look like I wasn't, how I stood when I was hurt and exhausted but still upright. Every detail going into whatever it was building. Don't let it learn you. Too late for that, probably, but I turned my back on it anyway, walked upstream along the far bank without looking back. The creek ran parallel to the access road, and if I followed it far enough, I'd hit the culvert at the trailhead and from there 200 yards to the trucks. I heard it at the bank behind me for a long time, the sound of something standing at the edge of water and not crossing, patient, measuring the problem, not ready to stop. Then I heard Virgil's voice. Short, wet, fading, my name, once, the shape of it more than the sound, not a call, not asking for help. Just the last word his body had left in it, spending it on the name of the last person he'd seen, then quiet. I stopped walking, stood on the far bank with the creek between me and the meadow and kept my eyes on the water and waited until I was sure. Then I looked. Virgil was on the ground in the center of the dead circle. The elk stood over him, head lowered, not feeding, not tearing at him, pressing. The skull bearing down on Virgil's chest with a slow and deliberate weight, finding the space in him that had gone loose when the ribs folded, pressing into it, finding a door, pushing it open. Virgil's hands moved once in the grass, fingers spread, reaching for something that wasn't there, then they stopped. The elk straightened up, and Virgil stood. Not the way a man stands up from the ground, the way the elk had stood up in the meadow that first morning, that deliberate sequence of solved problems, each joint deciding separately. The body rising piece by piece from the grass and finding its feet and settling into a posture that was almost right. He stood in the center of the circle with his arms loose at his sides and his head up and his face pointed at the far tree line. Virgil's face, Virgil's hands. Virgil's broad chest with the shirt torn and pressed down over broken things inside. Not Virgil. The shape of Virgil. It turned its head, slow arc, and it found me across 12 feet of running water, standing on the far bank with my boots soaking and my sidearm empty, and it looked at me with Virgil's face and Virgil's eyes and nothing behind either of them that had ever been the man who'd driven his state truck, meticulous, and quoted page numbers and been married 31 years to. The same woman. New vessel, bigger, more capable, everything Lottie had said it was looking for. I turned and walked, not running, walking, the creek on my left and the access road ahead and the culvert 50 yards up. In the rearview mirror as I turned onto the main road, a figure was standing at the culvert where the creek went under the road. Virgil's shape, Virgil's height. Standing at the water's edge on the upstream side of the culvert with its face turned toward my truck. Standing at the water. Not crossing. I drove to Lottie's that afternoon. The back door was open, not swinging, propped against the frame the way she kept it in warm weather when she wanted the cross breeze through the screen. The screen was unlatched. The kitchen was warm. The stove had been running recently, the iron still ticking as it cooled from a fire banked hours ago, a mug on the table with coffee still in it, a skin forming on the surface. Still faintly warm when I put my hand around the outside. Her chair had been moved to face the south window, the one that looked toward the flats, Someone had set it square with the glass, deliberate, aligned. Her left shoe was by the back door, just the one, set neatly beside the mat with the toe pointing out. I stood in her kitchen, the dried herbs in bundles on the beams, the 2 mugs on the hook by the stove, the photograph on the wall of a young woman who was Lottie at 30, standing in front of the same house with her hands on her hips and a look that said she'd outlasted everything this drainage had tried to put in front of her and expected to outlast whatever came next. I looked at that photograph. I drank the coffee she'd made. It had gone cold, but it was strong. No apology in it. That was right. I washed the mug and set it back on its hook because she would have wanted it back on its hook and she wasn't there to put it there herself. "Lottie Pruitt," I said to the kitchen, to the herbs and the beams and the photograph and the south window and the curtain moving in the April breeze. The stove ticked. The curtain moved. Outside, somewhere in the cedars, a bird was singing because it was spring and birds don't know the difference. I walked out the front door and latched it behind me. The official report would say unable to locate. There's a difference between that and missing that matters to the people who file these reports, and it matters differently to the people who write them. And I've been writing them long enough to know which version of the difference I was carrying home that evening. I drove to Earl's. He was on the porch when I pulled up. He'd heard the scanner, seen the emergency vehicles at the access road, seen the county truck. He'd been sitting in his chair since noon waiting for me to come tell him, because Earl Vance was that kind of man. He gave you the space to get to it. I sat on the porch steps. He sat in his chair. Coco pressed herself against my leg and I put my hand on her back and held it there and felt her trembling, a fine, constant vibration like something wound too tight. Her eyes were fixed on the south tree line, not blinking. Level 5, bloodied but still watching, still ready. I told Earl about Bobby the way it happened and not the way the official version would need it to be told. He sat through it with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the porch boards, and he didn't say a word until I was through. Did he suffer? I don't think so. I think it was fast. That was the true version and the useful version at the same time, and I was grateful it could be both. He looked at Coco. "She knows," he said. "Yes. She's known since the first morning. Animals always know first," I said. "That's the arrangement. They get the warning. We get the words." We sat with that for a while. The porch boards, the April evening coming in, the tree line going dark to the south. "What do I do?" Earl asked. "Pack a bag, take Coco, drive to your sister's in town and stay there until I call you. Don't come back to the south pasture. Don't come back to the flats. Don't come back until I tell you it's clear." He looked at Coco again. "She won't sleep inside anymore. Hasn't since the first week. She will at your sister's. Different ground. Away from the flats, she'll come back to herself." He believed me. I wasn't completely sure I believed myself, but I said it the way I say things that need to be true, which is flat and without qualification, and I left no room for him to push back on it. Coco loaded herself into Earl's truck without being asked. She never did that. Healers are working dogs. Working dogs don't volunteer for trucks until you put them in and they get back out and work again. She jumped in the cab, turned to face the window, and watched the south tree line through the glass while Earl started the engine and backed out of the driveway. She watched it until the road turned and the tree line disappeared behind the trees. Then she turned and put her chin on the dash and closed her eyes. Earl looked at me through the truck window before he pulled away. A long look, both of us knowing there was nothing left to add. Then he lifted 2 fingers off the wheel and drove. I stood in the driveway until the taillights went around the bend. Then I went back to the station and sat in the chair by the radio desk and didn't turn anything on. No heater, no radio. Just the building around me and the dark outside and the sound of April doing what April does when nobody is asking it to do anything. I sat there until the chair hurt and my knees said their piece and I ignored both of them. Eventually, I turned on the desk lamp and opened the ledger to a clean page and wrote the entry. Not the official one, the real one, the one that goes in the ledger nobody reads except me and whoever finds it after I'm gone. I wrote every detail in the order it happened, and I didn't dress anything up, and I didn't leave anything out that I could remember clearly. I wrote Lottie's name. I wrote Bobby's name. I wrote Dale's name. I wrote Virgil's name. I wrote Coco's name because Coco deserved to be in the record too, and because she was the one who knew first and knew longest and held her ground the whole way through. I wrote the hollow one in quotation marks the way Lottie had said it and left the quotation marks there. Then I turned out the lamp and sat in the dark for a while longer. The wild doesn't keep your records for you. It just takes what it takes and moves on, and doesn't leave a forwarding address. That's been true my whole career, and it'll be true long after the career is over. The ledger is mine. The record is mine. What I do with the knowing is the only part I get to decide. I decided to write it down. That's what this entry is. I stood in Earl's driveway until the taillights were gone. Then I stood there a while longer. The investigation ran 3 weeks. The county sent 2 search teams into the flats. They found Dale's boots, Virgil's rifle in the meadow grass. Signs consistent with a large animal attack in the center circle. No bodies recovered. The official version used 4 different explanations because there was no single explanation that covered the full geometry of it. And when 4 explanations contradict each other, people tend to accept the one that disturbs them least and file the others. Bobby Crisp, missing person. Dale Rucker, missing person. Virgil Hatch, wildlife incident, remains unrecovered, cause attributed to animal attack. Lottie Pruitt, unable to locate. Nobody used the word hollow. Nobody wrote the word vessel. The boots in the dead grass got noted as consistent with scavenger activity and filed in the supplement. I went back to Blackthorn Flats alone in June. I went alone because it needed doing, and because some things you carry yourself, not because you're brave. Because the alternative is letting it sit unfinished in a ledger somewhere, and that particular weight gets heavier every year you don't go back and look at it. The meadow had come in green, full spring, the way this country gets when it decides to be beautiful about it. Clover and ryegrass and the yellow flowers whose name I'd looked up twice and forgotten twice that come up in boggy ground after a wet April, a pair of red-tailed hawks riding thermals above the ridge. The creek running cold and clear over the flat stones, talking the same way it always talked. The dead grass circle was still there, brown and packed flat in the center of all that green, the ground inside it dark and compressed, dry even after a wet spring. The circle was wider than it had been in April, 4 or 5 feet wider. Whatever had stood there at the end had taken up more space than what had started the season. I didn't step inside the circle. Old habit. You don't step inside places that have been claimed. I followed the tracks. They left the circle heading east toward the tree line. Elk prints for the first 100 yards, deep and deliberate, the dew still on the grass around them, clean and sharp. Then the prints changed. 2-legged, still deep, the stride long, slightly too long, the spacing of someone who has been practicing the distance between steps but hasn't gotten the habit into the body yet. The toe placement carrying intention where intention doesn't belong in a walk. 50 yards of that. Then nothing. The ground was soft, boggy in spots from the spring melt. The prints should have continued all the way to the tree line. They didn't. They ended 50 yards short of the trees with nothing around them to explain the stopping. Just the last print, right foot, pointed east. And then grass. I stood there until the sun moved and the creek began to sound different in the afternoon light. Then the hawks stopped. Both of them at once, gone from the air above the ridge as if the sky had changed its mind about them. The meadow went quiet, not peaceful quiet, that other kind. The kind I'd known since that first Tuesday morning at the meadow edge. Something at the tree line was watching me stand at the end of those prints. I didn't look. I touched the brim of my hat. I walked back to my truck the same way I'd walked away from the creek in April, steady, deliberate, not giving the ground behind me a reason to think I was leaving fast. The drive out was normal, the access road was normal, the county road was normal, one line in the ledger when I got back to the station. It learned enough to walk out on 2 legs. Then it walked somewhere. I don't know where. Some things don't have a last page. They just have a place where you set the pen down. There are a few more things I want to put in this ledger before I close out the entry. Earl called me in August. He was still at his sister's in town. Said Coco had been sleeping fine since the first night, same as I told him she would. Said she'd been working his sister's yard the way healers work everything available to them, reorganizing the neighbors' cats and keeping the squirrels from the garden with an efficiency that was appreciated by some members of the household and not others. She was eating well. She'd put back the weight she'd lost in April. He asked if he could come home. I told him to give it until fall. He asked about Bobby, the way he'd been asking every time we spoke since April, a different question each time, working around the edges of the thing he wanted to know. In August, the question was whether Bobby would have known what was happening to him. I told him no. I told him I didn't think Bobby had time to know anything. That was the true version. I don't know if it was useful. Some versions of the truth you offer because the other person needs it and not because it helps you carry it. Earl said he was going to sell the south pastures, the 40 acres that ran down to the flats. Said he'd been thinking about it since April and he'd made up his mind. He didn't want to work ground that close to Blackthorn anymore, and he didn't want Bobby's name on that ground. I told him that was a sound decision. He asked if I thought it would matter, selling the land, whether the thing in the flats cared about property lines. I didn't have a good answer for that. I told him property lines never stopped anything that didn't already want to be stopped. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "It learned to walk on 2 legs and left." "Yes." "Where do you think it went?" I looked out the station window, the summer forest doing what summer forests do, green and loud and full of things that weren't worth worrying about. "I don't know," I said. "Somewhere it could keep learning." We didn't talk much after that. Earl went back to his farm in September. He called from the driveway to let me know he'd arrived, which he'd never done before and which I understood. He called me again 2 weeks later to say Coco had gone back to work on the cattle and was eating well and sleeping inside at night. She didn't go near the south fence. Neither did Earl. I've been back to Blackthorn Flats twice since June, both times in daylight. Both times I stayed close to the creek. The dead grass circle had grown over by the following spring, new growth coming up pale and thin in the middle of it, the ground not quite right but trying. The tracks were gone. I don't know if what was in that meadow found what it was looking for. Maybe it found something bigger and stepped inside, kept moving, kept adding to whatever picture it was building of the world. Maybe it's still practicing somewhere, getting closer to right with every step. I know it watched me long enough to learn a lot. I know that on nights when the wind comes from the south and the station gets quiet, I'll check the window before I go to the door. Old habit now. Something Lottie's grandmother taught her that I picked up the wrong way. Lottie's house sat empty through the summer. In October, somebody from the county came and boarded the windows, the south-facing one first, the one that had been set to face the flats. I drove by when they were doing it, watched them put the board up over the glass. I didn't stop. The wild doesn't care about reports or badges. It just takes, and it learns, and it goes. That's enough for this entry. My hands are tired and the coffee's gone cold. Until the next entry, this is Henry Blackwood, and this was my journal. Well, boys and ghouls, that wraps up another terror-ific tale from the vault. What beautiful country back there, but damn, the elk are creepy as fuck, right? I am 50-50 on if it's worth a visit. Poor old Dale Rucker, bless his heart. He finally got those new work boots he'd been putting off for 2 seasons. Didn't even have to pay for them, just had to leave the old ones standing in the meadow. Along with everything else, so sad, how tragic. Just how we fucking love it. Hit that subscribe button. New creature features drop every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Central, and trust me, the next one's even nastier. Leave a like if that dead grass circle in the middle of all that June green gave you chills. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? Have you ever seen an animal acting wrong, not sick wrong? Wrong, wrong. The kind you can't explain and can't quite forget. Drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. Until next time, kiddies, keep your fires burning and your eyes on the trees. This has been your Late Night Creature Feature. I'm Mr. Wendigo. And hey, look on the bright side. Virgil Hatch spent 22 years citing regulations, writing reports, and telling every ranger, farmer, and frightened old woman in the county that there was a perfectly rational explanation for everything. 22 years of that, thousands of forms, hundreds of citations, and in the end, the perfectly rational explanation for Virgil was wildlife incident remains unrecovered, filed by the same office he reported to every Monday morning for 2 decades. They even used his own paperwork format. He would have appreciated that, probably, maybe, if he was still the one doing the appreciating, but who cares really? Sweet dreams, kiddies, sweet dreams.